Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Paz. With me today is a very, very special guest, former NWA National Heavyweight Champion, former NWA US Champion, six-man champion, two-time NWA Tag Team Champion. He's been a TV champion in the NWA and the UWF, 1987 Crockett Cup winner. He's, of course, the Russian Nightmare himself, Nikita Koloff. Mr. Koloff, welcome to the two-man power trip. How you doing?
John, it is great to be with you. Thank you for having me on the two-man power trip. I love it.
Yes. So what's been going on in your world? What's going on lately? I know you obviously got the ministry going on and Man Camp.
I do. Lex Luger and I co-facilitate this camp for men called Man Camp, where we bring men in for a handful of days to we like to say teach, train, equip, empower, and then deploy them back home to just to be healthier in every aspect of their life. Mentally, emotionally, physically, of course, spiritually. Better husbands, better fathers. So all of your lady viewers out there might have an interest in that, or your female audience. And the conferences. I'm getting ready to head off to Ohio and Michigan and Kentucky and Delaware and do a one-day conference called the Man Up Conference. And of course, got my own podcast called the Man Up Podcast and radio show, and soon to launch a television version of the radio show, the Man Up Show. And so just a lot going on, John. I'm excited though. A lot going on.
Very cool. How did the Man Camp start? Obviously it's you and Lex, but how did that all get to fruition?
Well, it's a great question. He lived with me for about 10 months in 2015. And it was during that time together that we just felt like the Lord gave us this vision to put this conference, the one-day conference, and then the 5-day camp together. And again, just because of our backgrounds. So when I talk about being healthy in all these different areas, obviously you look at his physique, back in the day, as well as my own. We combined, we have a lot of years of experience in the gym, health and wellness and nutrition. And so, that was an easy one to be able to give people that information, give guys that information. If I think about, our journey outside of wrestling, 1993, I surrendered my life to the Lord, and 28 years I've been on that path of pursuing that relationship. For him, April 23rd, 2006, he surrendered his life to the Lord. So he's been on that path for 15 plus years now. And so, we just combine all of our experience, and when the Lord gave us that vision, we stepped out in faith and put it together. And so, bring those conferences into local communities. And then the camp, we just kind of bring everybody together in a little town called Royston, Georgia. We got a 100-acre piece of property that we rent down there, and it's amazing.
Oh, sounds cool. Sounds like a good time.
It really is. I mean, we have had tons of stories of guys returning home, and John, just how it has impacted their marriage, impacted them as a dad. In many cases, it has brought restoration of relationships between a father and a son, a father and a daughter, and just a lot of healing. And so lot of great stories. And so he and I are just inspired and encouraged, to keep doing what we're doing.
When you guys first met, I mean, obviously back in NWA days, were you always friends with Lex? Were you guys always had a good relationship or no?
Not really. In fact, people, I know we'll give in the show notes, you'll give some links to where people can learn more, whether it's about Man Camp, my podcast, and books I've written,
Yep.
and everything else. But there's a video, there's an interview that about maybe a 2-minute interview, and he had made reference to back in those days. We were wrestling peers. We were on a professional level, not so much on a personal level. Respected each other, of course, and he would say more than anything, we were just work co-workers, We were co-laborers in the wrestling world. And, my introduction to him was, dropping the U.S. heavyweight title to him in a cage in Greensboro, North Carolina. That was my introduction. We go on to have a lot more matches against each other and throughout the career. And then really, when I left wrestling in 1993, I didn't see him for nearly right around 11 years. Right around 11 years. So he went one way, I went the other way. I went down this path, get engaged in essentially full-time ministry. He continued on with his amazing wrestling career. And then in June of 2006, about 2 months after a jail chaplain, after his last time in jail. I mean, if you don't know Lex's full story, you're out there and you want to know more, go pick up a copy of his book, Wrestling with the Devil. You'll hear his whole life story. And through that decision in April of 2006, we were reconnected at a Christian athletes conference in Phoenix. And from that moment on, in June of 2006, we built a relationship, a friendship, a brotherhood, if you will, that has lasted till this day.
Yeah, because you always hear stories about Lex back then, like, oh, he didn't get along with this guy or that guy. So it's just funny to see like he's completely different as far as everybody says, like, oh, he's so much different than he was back in the day. He was very focused on himself back then, and back when you guys were feuding, even.
Right, and what I like to say it this way, John, he is evidence of a changed life, and so anyone who has had a true encounter, in my experience, anyone who's had a true encounter with Jesus, you're going to see that evidence of a changed life. Yeah, he'll be the first to tell you back then it was really his world. You were just living in it. He had what he called flex time. You were on his time. You were on flex time. And I'm probably one of the few who actually did like him back in those days. believe it or not. We did travel some together, not a whole lot, but there were a few trips we took together to towns and so began to build a foundation on the relationship we have now. But for the most part, when he portrayed, what was it, the narcissist up in the WWF?
Yep.
I mean, that was not far from the truth. So what you saw in that character, in a sense, was kind of him, outside the ring. And so, you meet him now. Anyone who knew him then, and you meet him now, there's no way you can't walk away going, he's a different guy. He is not the same man.
With you in wrestling, just like to kind of just break it down, when you broke in, who was the trainer? Was it Eddie Sharkey? Is that how you broke into the business?
Everyone thinks it's Eddie Sharkey, I guess, because he trained everybody else.
Right.
By everybody else, meaning Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, the Road Warriors, Scott Norton, I guess, and so many others. So I think many just assume he trained me.
Right.
That's the unique part about my story, John, is I was a weightlifter, a bodybuilder, a football player. And my dream, my goal was to play professional football. And so upon graduating college, I was on that path of playing pro football when I got recruited into wrestling through a phone call from Road Warrior Animal, who, by the way, I recruited out of New Brighton, Minnesota, Irondale High School, to play college football with me. That's where we first met, in college. And then he recruited me into wrestling. And so he gave me a phone number for a guy named Jim Crockett Jr., the promoter for the Mid-Atlantic Wrestling Organization. I had a 5-minute phone call with Jim Crockett, and I made sure before I drove to a city I'd never been, called Charlotte, North Carolina, he knew that I had no amateur wrestling background. I had zero professional training. I had never been in a ring. And he said he heard that. He was okay with that. So, John, I showed up the day he said to be there. 5-minute conversation, no other communication between then and the day I showed up, he took a look at me the day I walked into that office, and he saw a guy who was 285 pounds, 8% body fat, 34-inch waist. Nikita Koloff's born in the hallways of Charlotte that day. They literally put me right on the interview set. They introduced me to Ivan Koloff and Don Kernodle. They were the NWA World Tag Team Champions. I didn't know. I'd never heard of them in my life. I didn't know. Have a clue who they were. All of a sudden, I became Ivan's nephew. I'm on this interview set. We finish interviews for the day, and he says, be in Raleigh, North Carolina tomorrow night in the Dorton Arena. You're going to wrestle on television, having never been in the ring. That's the unique part of my story.
Pretty crazy. Obviously, he saw something in you immediately, like, wow, this guy looks like a star. He's a monster. He's on TV automatically. I mean, that never happens, ever.
It doesn't, does it? I mean, like, for real, to my knowledge, I mean, we tried to do some research on that. I don't know. I mean, maybe the closest one that maybe kind of comes to that, close to that story is Magnum TA. Has a similar story, not quite the same, but similar. And actually, Lex Luger did go to Hiro Matsuda's training camp, but it was only within a few months that they debuted him. But yet he still had a training camp. But yeah, it just doesn't happen. And so yeah, Crockett took a chance on me. I mean, I still had to make it happen, but fortunately, I did. And that first match, by the way, on television, I think he was smart enough to keep it short. So it was like 11 seconds, right? But then it was a meteoric career from there.
Yeah, think about that. Talk about learning on the job. I mean, that is really learning on the job. You never even were in the ring before. I mean, that's crazy. That's like really like, okay, I see something, this guy, I don't want him going anywhere else. Like, he's going in the ring tomorrow. I mean, that's crazy. Crazy story.
It is. And that night in Raleigh, like, they showed me how to lock up in the dressing room and a couple basic moves. And I went out and was able to capitalize on that. Now, I will say, for the, you said on the job training. So Don and Ivan and I, for about the next couple, 3 months, we would get to the towns 2-3 hours early, and they would bump and thump all over the ring for me, teaching me the mechanics of wrestling. And then every night on the drive home, we talk about that old school psychology of wrestling. I'd sit in their corner every night and watch their world tag match. Ivan, Uncle Ivan Jatoita. Uncle Ivan would sit in my corner, and then we just discuss psychology, and that's how I learned.
Wow, amazing. And obviously, you weren't familiar with the business too much, but obviously, Ivan Cole, a former WWF World Champion, defeated the legendary Bruno Sammartino. So, I mean, he knows a thing or two about teaching you psychology and teaching you wrestling.
He did. Him and Don both. Of course, Don was partnered up for a while with Sergeant Slaughter as Private Kernodle. And both those guys, Ivan at that point had I want to say 20 or so years of experience under his belt, and Kernodle about 10, 12 years, maybe more. So both of those guys. And then I was fortunate, John, in that first year to step in the ring with guys who, in the Mid-Atlantic anyway, were pretty legendary, but even outside of the Mid-Atlantic, I mean, guys like Dory Funk Jr., I mean, he was an NWA World Champion. I got to wrestle him numerous times early in my career. Johnny Weaver, Rufus R. Freight Train Jones, Blackjack Mulligan, eventually Dusty Rhodes, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, the Rock and Roll Express, Ricky and Robert. I mean, I got to step in the ring that first year with some pretty seasoned guys that only helped accelerate my career.
With you starting out where you were, who creates the name Nikita Koloff and who creates the Russian Nightmare? Is that Dusty, or is that you maybe collaborating?
So Don Kernodle and Sergeant Slaughter came up with the original idea of a nephew for Ivan. In their mind, they felt like, part of the story was Don, Don was an American turncoat, teamed up with Ivan, became the NWA champions, tag team champions, and then they'd bring a nephew in. And Don and Sarge rolled out this whole storyline. I mean, I credit those two guys. Nikita Koloff never would have been born if it hadn't been for those two guys. And then part of the story was eventually nephew and uncle turn on the American. Sergeant Slaughter comes in to Don's rescue, and we run a 2-year program for belts and flags and all kinds of stuff, right? The only hiccup in that plan was Sarge decided to stay up in New York with the WWF at the time. And so we still did the angle. It just Don had different partners. And then eventually, and that to say, in that hallway that morning when I met Don and Ivan, Jim Crockett said, okay, he needs a name. Now, we knew it was going to be Koloff, right? Because I'm a nephew.
Yep.
But he gave me Nikita and one other name that to this day, I don't even remember what it was. Because just the minute I heard Nikita Koloff. Now, I remember my history lessons in school about Nikita Khrushchev, right? The leader of the Soviet Union. And I just thought, John, to myself, I thought, Nikita Koloff, that name's got a pretty good ring to it. Sounds good. And so that's how the name came about. The Russian Nightmare, how that came about was Dusty and I started working an angle against each other. And I cut a promo basically, or I basically said, you're the American dream. Well, I'm going to be your worst nightmare. And out of that came the Russian Nightmare in teaming up with the Russian Bear, Ivan Koloff.
Makes perfect sense. The American Dream, the Russian Nightmare, perfect foil for Dusty.
Exactly, right?
With you coming along, like, okay, you don't have as much experience, but you have a great look, and you're going to be teaming with Ivan. And the Russians obviously is very hot topic at that point politically and everything else. What did you think about playing a Russian and being that character? Because that's like instant heat. The crowd immediately hates you, and you're new to the business. So what did you think about that? Because you're going to change your accent. I mean, you're going to do all these things and really play the character to the nth degree.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I didn't know it at the time because I didn't go to acting school. I didn't do it. I was an athlete. I didn't do any of that.
Right.
And so, but there's a terminology or a term that I later learned of what I did without even knowing what I was doing. And it's called method acting. And so in my mind, John, I just literally projected myself into that role and thought, okay, if I really was from Russia, how would I act? And eventually, when I start speaking English and I start talking, how would certain words sound? And I mean, I did take it to the nth degree. I legally changed my name. I got a Russian workbook and learned to sign Nikita Koloff in Russian. I learned a few words. I put a few bogus phrases together that sounded Russian, right? And for 6 months, I didn't speak any English like this anywhere in public at all. And then once I started speaking, it was very broken and like I was just learning, right? So I just did all that just really kind of on my own. Jim Crockett didn't even ask me to do that. I just did that. And then I carried that persona, something that's crazy too. When I look back, because I was old school trained, I was trained to protect the business at all costs, right? The terminology is kayfabe, right? Kayfabe, the business.
Yep.
And even post-retirement, I maintained the persona anywhere in public for 3 more years post-career.
Wow. Dedicated, right? I mean, keeping the kayfabe alive and really dedicated to your craft.
Yes, sir.
Now, you were so believable as a Russian. You were kind of thought of to play Ivan Drago, right? In the Rocky movie. Weren't you kind of up for that?
I was, and actually I just thought about you. You did ask me too about, my thought of during the Cold War era of portraying that Russian. I apologize. I'm like, I forgot to really address that. Because I just projected myself in, I really honestly didn't have any concerns about that. Even in the midst of, there would be an occasional phone call to the Crockett office. If the Koloffs come to Charleston, we're going to kill them. I mean, like for real, damn. 6 different times I had fans jump the barricade and come after me in the ring. In fact, only one fan got his hands on me, and that was the very first time because I wasn't expecting it. I didn't think about it, right? I thought we had security, and your audience can actually go watch that. It's called the Great American Bash 1985 world heavyweight title against Ric Flair. And you'll actually see a fan get his hands on me. Now, I didn't let that happen after that, but that happened. And so it was intense. And you're right. People did hate me from that night in the Dorton Arena when I went out. They didn't know me from Adam, but because I was with Ivan and Doc, I mean, they hated me from day one. And because of how I carried the persona, they continued to hate me more and more and more. I like to say they loved to hate me. And at one point became the number one most hated guy in wrestling. And so, you know, to have that experience was really pretty amazing. I want to make sure and address that as well. And so, but yeah, you know, the career at large, you know, and let me just say this too, to have that experience on both sides. And I know eventually you may get to, you know, the turn and what that experience was like, but I'm thankful, I'm grateful to have that opportunity to be on both sides, experience both sides.
It is crazy to think like nowadays they would never do something like that. But back then it's like, yes, the Cold War's going on. We're really going to create characters. To have so many people have that emotional investment of like hatred and, you know, that they want to go to the show because they want to see you lose. I mean, it's completely different. They would never do that stuff like nowadays. They don't want to get into politics and all that and like nuclear heat and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, it's a different era. In fact, I think McMahon's, I think they've tried some of that, and like you said, got a lot of heat for it. You know, like oh, that's it. You know, you're not being PC, like you said, right? You're not being politically correct. You can't do that. I mean, there's so many things we did back in those days that in today's climate, in today's culture, would be so taboo, man. I'd be like, you can't do that, you know, but just a different era, man. That's why the fans tell me, you know, I still do Comic-Cons and Legends autograph signings and those sorts of things. And the fans will tell me, they go, man, that was the golden era of wrestling. I wish it would be like that again, but I don't foresee it ever being like that again.
No, definitely not. So just to go back to it, were you supposed to be Ivan Drago at any point? Because you're playing this convincing Russian.
I'm sorry.
Hey, no problem. Yeah.
So the backstory on that is Terry Funk, who had I think he was in Paradise Alley, and he'd become friends with Sylvester Stallone, and I think Sly reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm doing another Rocky movie, and I got a Russian character. Do you know any Russians?" Of course, Terry had knew that Don and Ivan, you know, and I will say this too, like even Barry Darso, who eventually came in and played Crusher Khrushchev and went on to New York as Demolition Smash. You know, when he came in, he's like, "Man, we heard down in Louisiana, down in there, you know, the mid South, Bill Watts, you know, and other parts of the country that there was this shoot Russian in the Carolinas." He goes, "I should have known it was you. Oh my gosh!" Right. So even the boys thought like, oh, they really got a Russian guy there, you know. And so Terry Funk had heard that, and so he reached out to Don. And he said, you know, hey, Stallone's looking for you know, someone to fill this role in Rocky IV, Ivan Drago. And so long and short of that is they sent me this script. I memorized the lines. They flew me out to Hollywood for the screen test. It was me, Kerry Von Erich, and Dolph Lundgren. We were out of like, I think I want to say like, I don't know, hundreds, 800,000 guys they looked at. It came down to between the three of us. Well, I knew my odds went up by, you know, from 33% to 50% when Kerry, the day I got there, we were all there together, but he goes, "Hey, are there some lines we're like supposed to know for this?" I'm like, "Kerry, are you kidding me? Like they flew you all the way out here to screen test." So I'm like, well, that just increased my odds. So it really, I feel like, came down between Dolph Lundgren and myself on the set with Stallone, screen testing for that. And the reason I didn't get the role, remember 285 pounds, 8% body fat, right?
Yep.
Stallone, legit back then was, you know, he's only 5'6". Now he looks bigger in life on the silver screen, right?
Yep.
but he's only 5'6". He was about $160 back then, 160 pounds. And they later the director called me a couple, 3 weeks later and goes, even for Hollywood, your side, man, your delivery of the lines were the best of any. But your size difference, it's just even for Hollywood, it's just too unbelievable that Rocky at age 35 is going to beat a guy that looks like you, even
Right.
for Hollywood. And so that's why I didn't get the role. But a little side note that's interesting, right? And I found this out from a wrestling fan. So I love the fans, man. They find out everything. I didn't know, obviously, Ivan Drago, right? So they used the name Ivan for the character. And then I found out his manager in the movie, his manager was named Nikita.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Or Koloff. I think it was Koloff. So you use the first name in the one character is Nikolai Koloff. That's what it was. Nikolai Koloff. And I'm like, for real? Like, really? You're gonna use our names? But anyway, but I was just honored to even have a shot at it. It was a great experience, and loved the movie.
And Stallone is a big wrestling fan.
Huge. And his mom, she for years she was involved in that whole Glow, the gorgeous ladies of wrestling.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, big supporter. I think a big financial supporter in that too.
Oh, very cool. So I think the big part of your career is the Best of 7 series for the U.S. title, the feud with Magnum TA. Just talk to us about like the gravity of kind of, not that really putting you on the map, but I mean, that elevated you to another level because he was a huge star in the making. You're a huge star in the making. It's like something's got to give here. They got to have the Best of 7 to see which one of these two young guns can be the best.
Yeah. He was being groomed to be the next Ric Flair. In fact, he was only like 3 days away from flying to New York and inking a deal for the World Heavyweight title before his accident. He was only 3 days away from that happening, and they'd already made that decision that they're going to put the strap around his waist. But that angle, it is by far the most talked about of my career. Now, we talk about other things, the War Games, the matches against Ric Flair, the world title matches. Unification of the TV belts and etc. Sting Squadron, and all that. But by far the Best of 7, and a brainchild of the ingenious Dusty Rhodes, the Tower of Power, too sweet to be sour, if you will. Yeah, baby. Dusty was so creative, one of the most creative guys that I have ever met. That was his idea, the Best of 7. To my knowledge, it was never done prior to that. Obviously, he got kind of the idea from the World Series, right?
Yep.
Best of 7 in the World Series, and then to project it the way we did, right? I mean, Magnum looked like you said, the all-American good guy. I mean, just baby face. I mean, the face fans could fall in love with, and so, and then our personalities and our personas matched up, I feel, really, really well. Our chemistry, our style of work. And fans have told me like they were at the arena in some of those matches and said, they walk out going, I don't know about any of those other matches, but that match against Nikita Magnum was real. I mean, but that was our goal. Our goal was project that realism and draw the fan in. Of course, all these years later, the fans still love to talk about it, and definitely one of the highlights of my career.
It's one of those things where you watch those matches, like these guys are working a little snug. You know what I mean? You guys are definitely hitting each other.
Perfect word. Because some go, God, you guys were really stiff, or you, I'm like, I prefer the word snug. We worked out, but he and I were in agreement on that. That's where our styles are very similar. And I was okay with that. And he was okay with that. I'm like, Terry, let's get this thing across, man. Let's make people believe, we hate each other. And the last thing you want is for that United States. People didn't care about a Russian being a world champion, but for a Russian to wear the United States belt,
Right,
no,
yeah.
no,
Yeah, that's you can't, that's sacred. You can't
That's
be a
right.
U.S.
That's
champion.
right.
Yeah.
Can't let that happen. But the way we did it, I mean, 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, 3-1, 3-2, 3-3, come down to that seventh and final match, man. And a little side note on that, and unplanned, and TV production wasn't as state of the art as it is now, right? And because our matches were mostly spontaneous. And what I mean by that is, today's product is different, right? Everyone's handed a script and all that. Not in our world, not in our day, not interviews or anything else. There's a shot in there where the cameraman just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and that's where I hit Magnum with the chain, and I throw it off into the corner, and it's like basically slithers out of the ring like a snake right in front of the can. It couldn't have been more perfect, so that the referee, couldn't see it and didn't know what happened.
Love it. Now, as far as the accident, when that happens, it's that just like completely shake up, not only the whole roster, but you yourself, where you're like, oh my God, like this is crazy. This guy's about to be the NWA world champion. We're about to go to Starcade. He's about to be Ric Flair. He's going to be the next guy. Like, what's going through your mind as the whole NWA almost crumbles down right before your very eyes?
Yeah, how I first found out about it was in Philadelphia. It was in the Philly Civic Center, and Jimmy and Dusty pulled me up into a room privately, and I just got back from a tour in Japan. So again, in those days, communication then wasn't like it is now. So I didn't know. I had not heard. I didn't have a clue. And so when they shared that with me, truthfully, it took them a few minutes to convince me, because wrestling's a work, right? I'm like, you guys are working me. Magnum's fine. And they're like, no, he's like in the hospital fighting for his life right now. Might be a quadriplegic the rest of his life. I'm like, so once they convinced me, I was like, wow. I mean, you kind of, you get taken aback for a moment there. And we weren't the best of friends at that point. I mean, we were, again, more like Luger, more, working peers, co-workers, liked each other, but we didn't hang out with each other. And so once that settled in, I'm like, okay. Then they shared with me confidentially the idea of flipping and becoming Dusty's partner, coming to his rescue in that cage match in Charlotte, and creating the superpowers. And they left that decision completely up to me, again, because I don't know that there'd been a Russian good guy prior to that, right? Might have been. I just don't know. But I thought, well, between Jimmy and Dusty, I mean, they probably have close to 100 years of experience in the wrestling world. They know more than I do. And so I honestly, I just kind of trusted their judgment and went with it. And somebody did ask Dusty years later, did you know when you made that decision and did that, it would get over like it did? And he goes, we had no clue. We knew it was a roll of the dice. We had no clue whether it would or it wouldn't.
Man, the electricity and the energy. If you just close your eyes and listen to that crowd when you come out, when Ole and JJ are in the cage and Dusty's coming out, I mean, they pop is huge. It's one of those things where Dusty's probably like, well, with a roll of dice, I guess I got snake eyes, or whatever. Like, I guess I nailed this one, because man, that crowd was nuts, and you guys just obviously destroy Ole and JJ, which is great, but the crowd is awesome for it.
Yeah, I like to say we got double sixes. How about that? Even better.
Yeah, there you go.
We got double sixes, and I did verify this recently that actually Tony Schiavone was asked at some point in all of his wrestling career as an announcer, what was the biggest pop in wrestling he has ever heard, and he's on record as saying the night Nikita Koloff turned, and which I take as just a huge compliment. I mean, let's face it, Tony Schiavone's announced some pretty big matches.
Oh yeah.
And he's had some pretty large, pretty big opportunities in the world of wrestling and big shows to be a part of. So I'm very humbled at the thought of Tony acknowledging that was the biggest pop for his career in wrestling. And Yeah, you're right. And again, John, it goes back to that era of wrestling. Like if you even just watch fan reaction, not just that night, but in other match, it's more organic, right? It's the fans are much more engaged. Not that they're not engaged now, but everyone knows it's scripted, right? So, but in those days, there was still an element of surprise, and you didn't know for sure what was going to happen. And so that made fan reaction way more organic.
Man, it was crazy. What a pop. Were you nervous at all? Like, wow, I was this vicious Russian heel. Now I'm going to be a babyface. I don't know if we're going to work, Dusty. I know you kind of had faith and trust, but were you a little nervous before you head out there? Like, I don't know.
Well, I guess, perhaps, I suppose, yeah, I suppose perhaps a little bit similar to that night in Dorton Arena when I'm going to in front of a sold out crowd and I'm going to be on television. And so similar, I suppose, a similar type feeling. But I will say, for the record, prior to that, I actually had an experience as a babyface, as a good guy, over in Kuwait in the Middle East,
Oh, okay.
and not by design, but but by fault. And what I mean by that is, I went over to Kuwait and I was scheduled, actually booked against Sergeant Slaughter, and I went out and the fans cheered me. He came out and the fans booed him for whatever reason, right? In the Middle East. And I got in the ring and I'm like, Sarge, I don't know how to be a good guy. I have no clue. I'm like, all I knew is to like pound guys and hang guys with chains and whatever, right? And Sarge is so cool, man, right? So skilled and experienced. And he's like, kid, just follow my lead, kid. You'll be fine. Follow my lead. So I did have a taste of it over in Kuwait, but still never envisioned it would explode and become what it did.
So Starcade 1986, you're in the main event against the Nature Boy Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight title. Pressure here. I mean, you're taking obviously Magnum's spot. You might be christened the next, top babyface. What's the pressure like here? Because you and Flair are going to have a great match, but it's really kind of a huge, absolutely monstrous main event. I mean, Nature Boy Ric Flair, one of the greatest of all times, and it's Starcade.
Yeah, yep, and yeah, they're the granddaddy of them all, right? So
Yep.
fast forward or backtrack a year and a half earlier, and of course I'm wrestling for the very first time at the very first Great American Bash, and again another brainchild of Dusty Rhodes, the Great American Bash, and as a heel, right, as the baddest of the bad. Fast forward a year and a half later, now I'm wrestling him on the other side of the tracks as a babyface, as a good guy, and I had already at that point had dozens and dozens and dozens of matches against him. Sometimes a 1 hour draw. I mean, there have been numerous times I'd wrestled Rick for an hour, and I am on record as saying Rick is the consummate professional. He could make a broomstick look good. He made Nikita Koloff look good. and so I wouldn't say I was so much as nervous going into that one at Starcade as I was going into that first one at the Great American Bash. But that would just lead, that match in Starcade would lead to a number of other matches, return matches against him, and even some victories through disqualification. But of course, title can't change hands on a DQ.
Yeah.
So I did hold that world heavyweight title a number of times. And John, just for the record, there were two opportunities that Rick actually offered me the world heavyweight title, and I'm probably one of I don't know how many might qualify for this, but I'm at least one guy who turned the world title belt down.
Whoa, why is that?
It was more, I'd say, more of a timing thing. And for those who don't know that part of the story, I mean, that's where you might want to get. But I just updated my latest book, Nikita, A Tale of the Ring and Redemption, where I go into so much more of my story. And I had a wife die of cancer, Mandy. I had actually left wrestling at one point, and in the midst of my main event career, walked away to a sabbatical, if you will, to take care of her. She was diagnosed with cancer at age 24. It went into remission and then came back with a vengeance. And when it came back, that's when I stepped away to take care of her and just nurture her through that. She would pass away at the age of 26.
Oh.
And it was actually just a few weeks after her passing that he invited me down to his house in Charlotte. We had lunch by the pool side there, that he offered me the world heavyweight title. And it just didn't feel right. And then I'd say maybe a few weeks later, maybe a couple months later, I can't remember the exact time frame, invited me down again, offered it to me a second time. And I turned it down again. And looking back, no regrets in doing that. And I'd established my character where I didn't feel I necessarily needed a belt to be over.
That is true. I always was curious, like, wow, I wonder why Nikita never won the world title, because it seemed like it was trending in that direction. Obviously, you mentioned it could have happened a few times.
Yep.
So also, you mentioned Great American Bash. They also you continue the feud with the Superpowers and really with the Road Warriors, and they create war games, and you're a part of that. Man, I always hear stories from Arn and Tully and JJ. I mean, they're always talking about injuries and that those matches look brutal, but they really are brutal. What are your memories of the war games matches?
Yeah. Once again, another brainchild of Dusty Rhodes, to his credit.
Yep.
The first one, I like. So I say it this way. I mean, often imitated, never duplicated, right? I mean, they tried to rehash and bring other things around, in modern day time, but there's still nothing like the original. I don't feel anyway. And that very first one, I know we did a series of them. We traveled and took them on a tour, Bash tour, and then later Sting Squadron, teamed up on with a great team there. The Stinger and I, who Barry Windham, Dustin, I think Ricky Steamboat. I mean, great team against Steve Austin and I think Rude. And so, that very first one is the most memorable. The match beyond. And nobody knew what to anticipate. Nobody knew what to expect. But the electricity in the arena that night, the anticipation, the electricity, the response from the fans, and the way we illustrated that story, it's so much fun to be a part of. And of course, the formulation of the Superpowers, then combined that with the Road Warriors with Precious Paul Ellering, Four Horsemen with J.J. Dillon. You couldn't climb into a ring, whether it was a War Games, an 8-man match, 8-man tag, 6-man tag team, single match, against any one of those guys or all of those guys, and not have a great match. I mean, from Double A Arn Anderson to Tully Blanchard, who I just recently interviewed for my own podcast. You couldn't have I mean, you're just going to have a great match. Rick, Lex, any of them, or any combination of them. And so certainly the War Games brings back some great memories. And you made reference of injuries. What I hope by now your audience understands, and those who are wrestling fans, it is entertainment. I mean, that's clearly, we all know that now, right? It is entertainment. But to understand that there are real injuries. I mean, you're bumping and thumping all over the ring. You're 3, 4. My last match was against Vader, right? Big Van Vader, 450 pounds, legit. And he injured my neck in my very last match. It was not career ending, but nevertheless it did get injured. And I didn't know till the next day, but I had a hernia, picking up, body slamming him, right? Big guy. So I had hernia surgery. I was rehabilitating my neck. And it was over that Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's time that I made an executive decision under my own terms to walk away from wrestling. We can talk more about that if you want. But my point is, injuries in wrestling are very real. It's not an exact science. So timing only has to be off. I mean, you got a 400-pound guy coming off the top rope on you, or you're body slammed on the concrete floor night after night after night, running into steel poles, Russian chain matches, cage matches. Guys are going to get hurt. Guys are going to get injured. And it's just a part of it. And in those days, you didn't call in sick and there wasn't no can't make it to work tonight. You wrestled hurt. Many times I wrestled hurt because I had to, because I'm a main event. I can't just bail out on the main event match, right?
Right. And I know JJ really hurt his shoulder really bad in that War Games match, separated his shoulder really bad.
Yeah, I don't think I get credit for that one. I think that's one of the Road Warriors,
yes,
right?
Yes, it was, yeah.
So I can't. Lex likes to always say, I injured one of his vertebrae in that cage match in Greensboro for the U.S. title, and I'm like, but he has since forgiven me, and we've become best friends now. But he says, I forgive you. I'm like, thank you, but yeah, injuries are a very real part of wrestling.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people think like, okay, it's a cage match, or they know, but no, I mean, it's going to be war. I mean, War Games, it's going to be war, and man, so many of the guys. Arn always says, he got hurt, whether it be serious or not serious, but he would always be feeling it after the match. So those matches, especially back then, with the blood and just the aggression, it's just awesome to watch. But obviously, if you're in it, it might be a different situation.
Yeah, well, and on that note, yeah, I mean, when you're in the midst of it, you're just doing your job, right? I mean,
Right.
and it's just a mindset. I mean, John, we work quite differently back then than now. I mean, in 1986, I had 454 matches.
Whoa.
So yeah, do the math on that. So it's a different era of wrestling, and so it's more fun for me now to look back and do these interviews and discuss and talk about it. It's more meaningful now, and going out and do the autograph signings and the legends, Comic-Con stuff, and to hear stories from you, the fan, now on how maybe my career or my persona impacted you so many times. Hey, I got into weightlifting because of you, Nikita. Hey, I got into wrestling because of you. Hey, Nikita, I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. Wrestling was my outlet. And I just gravitated towards you. And so to hear those stories is so inspiring, so encouraging for me, that part of my goal now, John, is to give that back. Whether people are following me on social media or coming to a church where I'm speaking or one of our conferences or our camps, my goal now is to hopefully bring a inspirational, say motivational, positive, encouraging message, because of how encouraged I've been from the fans and hearing some of their stories, how I was a part of their childhood.
Man, just go back and look just at that era, but especially you. It's like, man, that guy was made for pro wrestling. If you just like look at somebody, they walk through a door, you're at a party or something, like, wow, who is this big, bald, looks like Russian monster? I mean, that was like kind of the time period back then where you were like really attracted to the guy with the it factor. It's like, okay, whoever this guy is, I want to watch him or see him. And you always had that it factor. And that was like the sign of that time where, Sting and Warrior and Lex, they had it too. But it was like a different feeling. It was like, man, this guy seems like he could do some damage. Like he's a kind of a scary dude,
Well, in fact, I've had numerous guys say, dude, you scared me as a kid, man.
Yeah.
You intimidated me. And I've had people say, it's interesting, kind of to that point. I've met people who know nothing about wrestling. And yet when I meet them, they go, I don't know wrestling, but I know that name. I've heard of your name before. So I'm grateful I chose that name, Nikita Koloff, and where now it gives me a platform to, like I say, to make a difference in other people's lives. But it was you might say, and this is not patting myself on the shoulder, please believe me, but a head turning, and that look and that persona was walking into a room, as you said, was very head turning, like you said, I don't know who this guy is, but he's somebody. Still today, I have people go, I can't figure out who you are, but I know you're somebody. Like,
yeah.
what's your name? And so, and I'll say this too, real quick. I had a much shorter career than many of my peers. I mean, Lex Luger had a 15-year career. Ivan was there for 3-4 decades. Flair, a lot of the guys, right? So where I'm very humbled, John, is my shortened career by choice. I've been coined, if you will, the Barry Sanders of pro wrestling, right? Your football audience will identify with that.
Yes.
But apparently, even though it was a very much shorter career than many others, it's made an indelible mark, or has left a lasting impression, which was partly my goal. When I broke in, I told Ivan and Don, I'll be out of active in-ring wrestling by the time I'm 35 because I'm going to leave on top. I'm going to leave as a champion. I want to leave an indelible mark in people's minds, and so I think I accomplished that.
Very much like Barry Sanders. Basically, he was around for 9 years. He was still in his prime when he retired. He's like, I'm done. It's like, oh, don't you want to keep on breaking all these records? Like, nah, I'm done. He left on top. No one ever remembers him, on the downswing. It's kind of like your career. It's like they always remember that great chunk of time where it's like, man, he was on top. He's won all those belts. He's, main eventing Starcade. So pretty remarkable.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Did you ever have a chance to go to the WWF? I know we're talking obviously NWA, your WCW, all that, but did you ever have a chance to go to WWF?
To my knowledge, they never try to reach out to me, unless in those days the old school voicemail. I say if they left me a message on my voicemail, I missed it somehow. But the only consideration when Darso left as Crusher Khrushchev, he let me know he's going up there to become Demolition. And invited me to be his partner. And I just, in my mind, I felt I don't want to change character. I've worked so hard on the character Nikita Koloff. Why would I want to go be somebody else now? Yeah, I could have probably went there and made 10 times the money, 50 times the money. I don't know. The money wasn't as important to me. Or I didn't want to change characters. And I met Vince in a gym in Las Vegas one time, but we never talked about business. We just a cordial conversation in the gym in Las Vegas. And more important to me, John, was the word loyalty. And even though I could have leveraged my success in the NWA, and as I said, either forced Crockett to pay me more or jump to the WWF. More important to me, it was being loyal to Jim Crockett because he gave me my break. You just heard my story. He gave me my break. And so I always had felt very fortunate, very grateful and thankful that Jim gave me that opportunity. And so, and even though he sold it to Ted Turner and all that, I still felt a loyalty to the NWA and that brand of wrestling. And so I never really considered a jump.
You would have been a perfect heel or perfect foil for Hulk Hogan at that point too, especially with him being the true blue All-American. To me, it was like, wow, that would have been an awesome dream match.
Yeah, it's one of those what ifs. I mean, the magazine, shout out to Bill Apter, who was instrumental in my career as well. All the magazine cover shots, head shots. I mean, everything that Bill Apter did for me to build my career. And of course, WrestleMania, what if? What if Nikita Koloff had wrestled Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania? I don't know that we would have broke the record of 93,000 in Detroit, but we probably would have drew and would have made a pretty sizable payday. But again, I've never really been one motivated by money.
Now, as we hit the wind down, we head towards the finish here. I know you kind of said no regrets about obviously not winning the NWA title and stuff, but do you have any other regrets in wrestling? Something you didn't get to do or you wanted to do, or is everything perfect the way your career worked out?
It's a great question. I mean, looking back on my career as a whole, the short answer would be no. Not really. I mean, I just feel very grateful to have had the opportunity to have had that career and how it gave me a platform to to what I call, John, my ultimate calling, which is, essentially full-time ministry, and wrestling actually became like a training ground, a training center for me. Because when I look at my career, I flew on airplanes, I rented cars, I talked on microphones in front of cameras, entertaining crowds for a living. Then I find myself at an altar, surrendering my life to the Lord. And I look at the last 28 years. I'm like, what have I done the last 28 years? So I know I've flown on airplanes, rented cars, stayed in hotels, talked on microphones in front of cameras, not to entertain crowds, although I can do that, but to bring a more important message of the gospel, of the good news. And so thankful and grateful. If I had to summarize my life up to this point, the one word, if I distilled it down into one word, the word would be surreal. I mean, never in a million years would I have ever, as a kid, I didn't dream of being a wrestler, a pro wrestler, but I became one. And then I had the career we just highlighted and discussed. I didn't ever dream in a million years I'd be an evangelist, a minister, and be doing camps with Lex Luger and but that's where God's called me to. And so my life, in summary, it's just been surreal. And all of my experiences, both good and bad, I wouldn't change them or erase them, because they've made me into the man I am today.
Do people, like, when you're doing the ministry and stuff, does anybody get surprised? Like, say they're an old school fan, like, wait a second, his voice, like, what? I thought he was Russian. Do people say that to you a lot? I feel like they would.
Still, last weekend, I was doing a TV show in Aiken, South Carolina recently, and it was an older gal, and I walk in and introduce myself to her, and she said something to me in Russian, and I just start laughing. I'm like, I don't have a clue what you said. She goes, wait, you're the Russian nightmare. How do you not know Russian? She goes, I thought I was going to build some points with you because I could speak a few words of Russian. I go, it's just a persona, that I. So one would think with the internet and all these interviews and everything else, it might take 30 seconds to find out, one, I'm not really from Russia. So two, I don't speak Russian, but yeah, still to this day, man, it happens all the time. It's hilarious.
I feel like when you're a wrestling fan, especially a certain period of time, things just like are ingrained in your head, and you can't. It's like the suspension of disbelief or whatever. It's like you're willing to believe it, and you can't get that out of your head. So like, wait a second, I thought he was right. Wait,
yeah, you can't separate that,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like even I'll go to churches. They're like one guy said the other day, he goes, man, I'm going to have to listen really carefully to understand what Nikita's saying. And they're like, oh my gosh, they're shocked. And I just have fun with it. Like I have this little 1-minute icebreaker video clip that I open up with, and it opens up with me doing an interview in character. And then at the end, Sting is actually interviewing me on a ministry show and just sharing a little of my testimony, talking like this. So I get to have some fun with it and say, aren't you impressed by how well I've mastered the English language? So.
Yeah, to me that's amazing, because I could picture in my head, like, thought he was Russian. What is going on here?
Right.